This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we talk to a member of a group of anonymous feminist art activists known as the Guerrilla Girls. Guerrilla Girls formed well over 3 decades ago to challenge the art world to combat sexism and racism. We hear from one of them, who goes by the name Frida Kahlo, about how activism can move the art world away from the rich, who control what art is, where it's displayed, and who's buying it. You can join our conversation today, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, today we're talking about women artists because they're the focus of a year-long initiative by the New Britain Museum of American Art. In studio with me now is Min Jung Kim, the museum's director and CEO. Min, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning.
We actually had a chance to chat, about a year ago when the Georgia O'Keeffe exhibit was at the museum. So you've been director and CEO for 4 years now. Tell us about your tenure.
Well, I joined. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a scratch in my throat this morning. I joined the New Britain Museum of American Art in 2015. Really excited to join a wonderful museum that is, for many of your listeners who may or may not know, one of, if not the oldest museums of American art in the country, with really a premier collection that tells the story of American art from the 18th century to the present, with particular strengths in our collection from Hudson River School, American Impressionism, Ashcan, the Eight. We have a fantastic 5-panel mural by Thomas Hart Benton that was first commissioned by the Whitney Museum of Art in 1932 that we acquired and accessioned in 1949-1950. And our holdings run through contemporary art, including contemporary Connecticut native Sol LeWitt, who, of course, was born in Hartford but raised in New Britain. And so in addition to our wonderful permanent collection and exhibitions and educational programs, I was really thrilled to be a part of the New Britain Museum of American Art. And at the same time, recognizing that as an American art museum, we are, of course, committed to presenting the nation's diverse heritage, but also to explore this ever-evolving and unfolding narrative of American art and culture, including what it even means to be American. And recognizing that, national identity is neither homogeneous nor monolithic, but rather one that comprises a multiplicity of cultures and races and ethnicities. I was very excited that through the museum, we could share a picture of American art that is one of a rich and varied diversity. So that also means including the voices of artists who also happen to be African American, Latin American, Native American, Asian American, or simply put, all American. So the focus during my tenure in the last few years at the museum has really been presenting also greater diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, not only because it then becomes a truer representation of Americans today as we're seeing these demographic shifts occur in the country, but also because it becomes a more accurate reflection of the very communities in which we live and for whom we serve.
I mentioned that this year, again, the New Britain Museum of American Art is going to have several exhibits focused on women artists. Why 2020?
So this year we're doing something very special in light of the fact that the year 2020 celebrates the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the constitutional right to vote, which is a major moment in the history of this country. And it's equal to take it's easy to take equal voting rights for granted these days, but in reality, the passage and the ratification of the 19th Amendment at the time was very controversial because it was not only simply a political argument, but really it was a cultural and a social and a moral debate surrounding gender issues and overturning centuries of tradition. So It was a major moment, and it was also a long struggle that publicly ensued for about 72 years, beginning with the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments. And so 2020 marks a moment to be able to remember it and celebrate it and all that's been accomplished. At the same time, we see that it's also a moment to reflect, not only in terms of all that has transpired and the progress that has been made, but also, quite frankly, what more work is yet to be done, especially as it pertains to issues of gender equality.
When we look at museums in our country and we think about this issue of gender inequality, when we are going to a museum and we see art on a wall or art displayed, how often are these collections really involving women artists, men?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I think these issues of gender equality, unfortunately, we see that the underrepresentation of women really still persists throughout the 21st century, and in museums in particular. The number of women artists that are represented in museum collections and given opportunities for solo exhibitions across the board, not just the New Britain Museum of American Art, it tends to be less than 25%. I mean, there are varying statistics. And this is exactly why we wanted to dedicate this year, 2020, in the celebration of women. And so we've committed the entirety of this year's special exhibition devoted exclusively to women artists. So from January to December, we'll be presenting 7 major exhibitions, 5 solo exhibitions featuring artists such as Kara Walker, whose show we opened this month, Annie Albers in March, Chantel Martin in May, and in November, Jennifer Wenma and Helen Frankenthaler, respectively, in November, as well as 2 group thematic exhibitions, one of which will be featuring Shaker women and their gift drawings, as well as in August, a fabulous group thematic show entitled Some Days Now, Women, Art, and Social Change. And this is a major year-long commitment that we're doing as part of the museum in the year of 2020. But it's also important that this is an ongoing and a long-term commitment on our part as well to be able to feature not only more women, but also more women of color.
You're hearing on the show today on Where We Live, Min-Jung Kim, Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. As we hear about this special focus the museum is taking in the year 2020, you can join our conversation, 888-720-WNPR. That's 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Earlier, Min, you said during your tenure, you're really wanting to focus on what exactly, when we talk about American art, what that means. When someone goes to a museum, are they necessarily thinking about, the gender of the person making the art, or that the art speaks to them? And then how do you maybe respond to people who might think, why is this important, instead of just working to showcase artists, whether they're men or women?
Well, I think all of it's important, and that's exactly what we're trying to address at the museum. And the fact of the matter is that as an American art museum, as I mentioned, we're really committed to portraying and reflecting the voices of all Americans. And that's regardless of gender, it's regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, it's regardless of sexual orientation. And the fact of the matter is that without having some awareness as to who these artists are and what those messages are conveying, we have seen through statistical data that it has created an imbalance of sorts of artists being represented. So unless there is a conscious awareness and a concerted effort and thought and process given with intentionality, this will continue to create a situation where we're only hearing half the story of Americans and the American narrative.
You mentioned earlier also some of the women artists that you will be featuring this year. Some of those names may be familiar to people like Annie Albers or Helen Frankenthaler. But tell us a little bit more about Kara Walker, for instance, who is going to be opening at the end of this month, and why you chose these particular artists specifically.
Sure. So Kara Walker is an amazing artist who really throughout her career has always addressed issues of gender and race and identity in her work, and in particular the representations, or rather the misrepresentations, of African Americans from both historical and contemporary times. And so the work that we're featuring as part of this exhibition is called Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, which is both the title of the exhibition as well as the portfolio of 15 prints based on the anthology that was published in 1866. And Kara Walker, she has enlarged a selection of illustrations from this anthology, and then she's overlaid them with her own silkscreen cutout solid silhouettes that really bring to the fore very traumatic racist experiences that had been left out of the official record. And so this is an important body of work by an important artist, and we are particularly excited to be launching the year 2020 with Kara Walker, with this exhibition and work that also happens to represent a major acquisition that we have done and we are now proud to have as part of our permanent collection.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Min Jung Kim, Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. What do you think about the museum's special focus on women artists this year? You can join us 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Coming up, we're going to hear from one of the artists featured, a visual artist named Chantel Martin. And again, we hope to hear from you too. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. According to the National Museum of Women in the Arts, 8 out of 10 artists in most museum collections are male and white. And worldwide, a little more than a quarter of major exhibitions are devoted to women artists. The New Britain Museum of American Art is working to change this. Later this month, it begins a year-long project showcasing 7 groundbreaking exhibitions devoted exclusively to women artists. Min Jung Kim, the director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art, is with me in studio. And joining us now via Zoom is one of the artists being featured later this year, Chantel Martin, a visual artist who does live drawing installations in black marker in white galleries. Chantel, welcome to our show.
Oh, good morning.
Very nice to speak with you today. I know you're joining us from the West Coast, so we appreciate you getting up extra early. Tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners who may not know about your background and your work. Where did you grow up, and how did you, I guess, venture into the art world?
I grew up in Southeast London in a place called Thamesmead, and some people might be familiar with that if they've seen movies like Clockwork Orange or recent shows like Misfits. And it's one of these interesting places. It's extremely white, very working class, and not a place where you expect to find museums or galleries or artists. And so I wasn't exposed to any of those things until much later in life. So it's interesting now at this point in my life working with museums, and that being something that I wasn't exposed to when I was younger. But, basically through a life of doing things that people told me that I couldn't do, I got myself to art school, and from there ended up in Japan, where I started my career actually as a VJ, as a visual jockey, doing live drawn digital analog visuals to DJs and dancers and musicians. And this taught me so much and informed kind of the basis of my style and career, in the sense that it's kind of magical when you draw live. You don't have time to be anyone else but yourself. And it's almost a crash course or a fast forward way of extracting your inner self or your inner identity because you get to repeat that in that position where you don't have time to think or plan. You just have to draw because people are watching you. And so fast forward, I moved from Japan to New York, and in New York there wasn't this kind of digital VJing scene, and you could say in many ways that I de-evolved and picked up pens, but worked in the same way. And I've been doing pretty much that since the last 10 years, but have managed to do it in a way where it's regardless of the medium or regardless of the discipline. I've worked in many different industries, but have had this foundation of a line or a drawn line.
It's interesting to hear your trajectory, Chantel, but I wanted to unpack a little bit, and I wanted to go back to your upbringing in London. You are a woman of color. As you were growing up, and you talked about the importance of being an individual, how was that brought out in you from your background? And then why Japan, of all places?
Yeah. So it's actually, it was brought out in me from the moment I would leave my door every day. So as I mentioned, I grew up in a very kind of working class white area. And I, as a child was brown and with an afro. And so, it's interesting at home when you're in your home and everyone sees you as their sibling or as their daughter or as a member of their family. And then as soon as you walk out, people see you as black, or they see you as brown, or they see you as other. And what that taught me from a very young age is that people will put their emotional baggage or assumptions on you, especially when it comes to race, and in England, especially also when it comes to race and class. And so from a very young age, I had to be an individual, and I had to be self-efficient, and I had to be confident, because as soon as I would walk out of my house in any kind of setting, people saw me as an other, and they saw me as being different. And on one hand, looking back, that was great. That was a passport. And, that allowed me to be different, because if you don't fit in, you don't also have that pressure to fit in like everyone else. And I feel like that passport allowed me to go to Japan, a place that I think very few people where I'm from would even know about or aspire to go to. But there's something that drew me into Japan. I think first I got obsessed with Japanese art and movies and things like that. But I got to visit Japan for the first time in 1999. And it was the first place I went to where everyone was the same race. And it was the first place where when people asked me where I was from, and when I answered I was from London at that time, people said, "Oh, okay, that's cool." And there wasn't that second question of, what are you? What really are you? And so actually, I went to somewhere like Japan to almost be liberated in just being an individual and being self, and not having to deal with this other layer of people's baggage of race.
You're hearing Chantel Martin, one of the artists that's going to be featured at the Britain Museum of American Art this year, as it focuses on women artists, this 2020, 20-plus women, several exhibitions throughout the year. Chantel, growing up, you were expressing yourself through art. When you decided you wanted to make this a career, what did your art teachers tell you? Did they encourage you?
My art teachers told me, Chantel, don't do art, don't pursue art, because, you probably won't be good at it, or you won't get anywhere with it. And, I think some people might gasp when they hear that. But actually, when I look back, based on the circumstances of where I was from and what people do where I'm from, you can also see that teacher, on one hand, could have been quite responsible in saying, "Hey, Chantel, don't do this thing that no one will ever support you to ever do, and that no one ever from this kind of background or area has ever really done successfully." So on one hand, you can see now that was quite responsible. But on the other hand, you can see the limitations of some of these places where, we talk a lot about people taking art out of schools, but then we don't talk about people not actually supporting artists to have that as a successful career. So what you end up having is you can only really be successful in a lot of scenarios or cases when you've come from a place of a lot of support and, a lot of a very carefully crafted path. And then for the other bunch of us, in a way, it's never ending struggle. And a lot of artists ask me, Chantel, how do you become an artist? Or, what do I need to do? And I first say, don't be an artist, because it's an absurd career where no one really supports you and you're always struggling, and that struggle never goes away. It just changes. But at the same time, there's something beautiful about being an artist, because it is a way how we get to self-reflect and connect with people and have these shared experiences.
Chantal, you mentioned earlier when you were in Japan, you were doing live drawings using a camcorder in these clubs. At this time, you were called a visual jockey. But can you describe to us how your art has evolved today? I tried to do that when I introed you about doing these live drawings in black marker and white galleries. But describe how you create.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting way you described it. But, sometimes it's white and black, black and white, and sometimes there is also color. So imagine the way that I'm creating, it's about a line, and it's about having this fluid line. And that line could be digital, it could be analog, it could be made out of any medium that you think about. But the idea about this line is that it's confidently me. And that line, anyone can draw a line, but the line is realistically a sense of kind of my journey in that way. And so to describe it, a lot of the work is created live. And that's not because I'm a performer in one hand. I feel there's a benefit of creating work live, because on one hand, people get exposed to the process of art and art making. And I think there's something really magical about that. You don't lose any magic as an artist by sharing your process, but I feel that you get to share that magic with people. And then on the other hand, it keeps you honest, because you're creating live. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't have time to be anyone else. And I've managed to take this form of a line that is recognizably me into different mediums. So you'll see my work on sneakers, or on walls in museums, or on aeroplanes, or on drawn works on paper, or on circuit boards, or in technology. And so it's managed to have kind of really a nice life in a cross section of mediums.
With us also, besides talking with Chantal Martin via Zoom, is Min-Jung Kim, Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. We heard Chantal describe, how she creates. Why did you feel it was important to have an artist like Chantal as part of this year-long series, Min?
Well, Chantal is perhaps one of the most versatile artists working today. And as she was describing her exploration of the potential of the drawn line, the fact that she's using a somewhat ubiquitous ink marker, and yet she, with that, creates these incredible variety of works, from these small sketches to monumental murals, to these live drawings that are performed in music venues, but also these incredibly innovative commercial collaborations that she's been doing with these well-known fashion labels like Puma and Max Mara and Tiffany. She also brings a rather unique perspective, I believe, as a biracial LGBTQ artist who has lived all over the world, including Tokyo, as she's described. But I think perhaps also most significantly, what's wonderful about Chantal's process is that she reminds us about the creativity that we all possess from a young age. And, as she uses that marker, we could also remember times when we were children, and we would draw with markers all of these things and use our imagination. And somehow along the way, as we grow up, we lose a little bit of that. So she proves that ultimately art is and can be for everyone, which I think is a really empowering message.
Ironically, we're doing a show tomorrow about children's creativity and that moment that happens where our creativity is squashed. Chantal, I'm hoping that you can build on what Min was telling us about how you see people responding to your art. And when you tell them that they have the power to create, what is their reaction?
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. And it's interesting. The question I love to ask, especially a lot of adults, is, can you draw? And actually, most adults that are not in a creative industry, and actually quite a few adults in a creative industry, will tell me that they can't draw. And, I like to point out that it's something that we used to do as children. So, of course, you can draw as an adult because you did as a 2 or a 3 or a 5 or a 6-year-old. And so it's something that we learn that we can't do. And it's a limitation that we learn. And I feel like that is the basis of us in a way losing some of this creativity as adults. And there's such a benefit in all of us having this gift or this technique of drawing or mark making that is from our head to our hand. And, we should all do that because there is a benefit from that. And that's why we do it as children. And it shouldn't be everyone's career, but it also shouldn't only be reserved for artists. And so I really, applaud and support people in drawing and mark making just for themselves. And, with regards to museums, there is this sense of accessibility. Sometimes museums can still, even for me as an adult and as an artist, feel incredibly intimidating sometimes to walk into. You walk into and someone asks you if you're a member and you're like, wait, should I be a member? I don't know how this works. And I think, we really have to work on bringing everyone to the museum because there is such a benefit in people being in that space and enjoying the works. And as, you were talking earlier, seeing the voice of the culture and of the history as it is now. And so, the more that we can show, especially young people and young children, that, actually you can get in for free to the museum and you are already naturally a member, and, also supporting other people to come in that don't feel like the space is for them. There is such a huge benefit there because those are also the voice of the people today as we are.
Min, as a director of the New Britain Museum of American Art, how is your museum encouraging people in your community of New Britain and other places to feel like they are welcome?
Right. Well, so as Chantal mentioned, free admission, we do offer that much thanks to a grant made available by the American Savings Foundation where every Saturday morning museum admission is free because we want to also make sure that we eliminate any kind of financial barriers for anyone coming into the museum. But I think ultimately it's really about the kinds of programs, exhibitions, and content that we show at the museum. And as part of an American Art Museum, indeed to show artists of all genders, of all colors, really touching upon topical and timely themes that are relevant to people today. And at the end of the day, indeed, if we want to be able to engage a wide and diverse audience, I think we only do so by showing reflections of themselves or topics that are relevant to them literally hanging on the walls of our gallery, not just addressed as some symbolic program, but something that is really integrated throughout the museum and as part of our mission and our vision as well.
Chantal, I mentioned at the earlier part of the show that 8 out of 10 artists in most museum collections are male and white. How do you respond to that statistic as someone who is an artist and is creating around the world? This is a focus of the New Britain Museum of American Art for 1 year, but what else needs to happen to expand this idea of gender equality across the art world?
Just as Min was saying, if you don't see people like yourself in these situations, then you can't imagine yourself in them. And, there's obviously a lot of men in the collections and white men, and then there's a lot of women and, white women, and then probably the same women as well. And so, I feel like it is important to see people like myself who are, from these different communities that face all of these barriers and hurdles that do not see ourselves reflected back in these spaces, and therefore we feel like that we do not belong. And as Min was saying earlier, it took 100 years for the vote for women and especially Black women, and that's almost as much as a kind of a dedication now that we should be giving to this. It's like, we can give a year, but then let's give 100-year commitment because it took us 100 years to get here as it is. So let's give another 100 years to, hopefully it doesn't take that long. But, it's nice to hear that these commitments are long and that they are lasting. And it's also important not to just show people like myself, but also to put us in the collections, because otherwise in 10 years or 20 years time, it's great that people like myself had solo shows, but if museums as a whole are not actually also adding us to the voice and the legacy of the collection, then when people look back, they don't see us reflected then either.
Min, can you talk about that as a director of a museum, about the importance of acquiring the work, not just having these exhibitions and then it moves on somewhere else?
Absolutely. And as much as our emphasis this year is really about dedicated to featuring women artists throughout our special exhibition, similarly, we have a particular focus on continuing to acquire and accession works by women artists into our permanent collection as well. As I mentioned, the first of the series that is launching our 2020 year initiative, the work by Kara Walker, is both an exhibition as well as a major acquisition that has recently entered the New Britain Museum collection. And as is our general common practice, we often do acquire and accession works inspired and generated from exhibitions. So I hope to be able to show that a number of works and women artists that we are featuring this year will indeed become a part of our permanent collection. You know, I think at the end of the day, there are multiple things that we need to do as a museum in terms of, yes, creating greater platforms for exposure through special exhibitions, and including many of these artists and works as part of our permanent collection, but also using this as an ongoing long-term effort, not only just within the museum world, but really opening and widening this conversation as a whole. And so this year's initiative and year-long commitment, organized by the museum, also would not have been possible without the help of our presenting sponsors, Stanley Black & Decker. And while, of course, I'm hugely grateful for their generous financial support, I think the partnership is also especially meaningful because this is also a corporation that has similar values and beliefs aligned with a focus on diversity and inclusion that also ultimately drives innovation and growth as well. And so they've been focused on gender parity and equality and elevating women in leadership. And so in addition to exhibitions and collections, as part of this 2020 initiative, I'm delighted to also be partnering with Stanley Black & Decker to also create a whole series of programs that touch upon issues of women mentorship, networking, developing opportunities, and quite frankly, creating a platform for conversation for a lot of these issues. So there is the concerted effort on the museum's part, and no doubt these gender disparities really are deep-rooted at the institutional level. And so as a museum, we acknowledge that we play a significant role and part in that. And there are some potentially temporary solutions as we are launching this year-long initiative of special exhibitions, but the longer-term lasting effects are really influenced by how we continue to develop our collection, how we continue to create these issues and bring greater awareness through programs and conversations, not simply only within the museum, but beyond in a much wider and expanded circle.
As a leader of a cultural institution, we hear so often that support has been diminishing for arts across the board. And when we think about the traditional group of people who are supporting institutions like yours, they may, maybe there's some tension in terms of, well, what is this what we want to be doing? Is this, maybe they have an idea of what traditional art is, and how do you push back on that kind of tension because you feel it's important to expose the community to different perspectives like Chantel's?
Right. Well, I think all art, traditional art, was at one point in time contemporary for its time. And all art was addressing issues that were pertinent for its time as well. And as we're talking about issues of gender, as we're talking about issues of equality, this is one of the most topical and timely issues of our time, as it was, quite frankly, throughout history as well. I mean, one of the other exhibitions that we'll be showing as part of this 2020 year-long initiative is an exhibition called Anything But Simple: Shaker Gift Drawing and the Women Who Made Them. And this is an exhibition that features rare Shaker gift or spirit drawings, if you will, that were all created by women between the years of 1843 and 1857. And they're remarkable in that these young Shaker women considered themselves to be spiritual instruments, receiving visions, which they both transcribed and drew into these incredibly beautiful gift drawings. But the reason why this exhibition was also important to include, and the Shaker women in particular, is for those who aren't quite as familiar with the Shakers, they were a religious group that was founded around 1747, who immigrated from England to the United States around the 1780s. And while they may be more known for their craftsmanship and architecture and technological innovations and furniture, perhaps, they were also a very progressive community. And they were practicing communal living and pacifism, and perhaps most appropriate to this conversation, gender equality. So as much as we talk about gender equality, perhaps as more of a 20th or 21st century phenomenon, as a contemporary issue, clearly this is something that existed throughout the centuries and was something that was important, which is why I think the Shaker exhibition is one of many other exhibitions that we will continue to explore this issue.
Well, I want to thank Chantel Martin for joining us again. She'll be part of a solo exhibition later this year at the New Britain Museum of American Art. You'll be coming to Connecticut for that, Chantel. We appreciate you giving us some of your time today to talk about your work. Thanks so much.
Cool, thank you. And I just want to say, take the time, everyone, go to a museum, do that instead, because there is a benefit for seeing art for you. So, everyone, please go out and support your local museums and go and see some great art.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Also with me in studio, Min Jung Kim, Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. Coming up after the break, we're going to talk to a member of the Guerrilla Girls, an anonymous group of art activists pushing for gender and racial equality in the art world. And we want to hear from you, too. 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to talk about how all of us can foster children's imaginations. But today we've been focusing on an initiative at the New Britain Museum of American Art. 2020 is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, when women were granted the right to vote. The museum's highlighting this milestone by devoting a year to presenting exhibitions by women artists. It will also include work by the Guerrilla Girls, a group of anonymous feminist art activists who formed well over 3 decades ago to challenge the art world to combat sexism and racism. One of the founding members of the Guerrilla Girls is joining us now by phone, who uses the alias Frida Kahlo. Frida, welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here, Lucy.
So first, tell us why the group prefers to remain anonymous and that you use these pseudonyms.
Well, we started in 1985 when the art world was a much smaller place, and we actually were a little hesitant to complain about the world that we wanted to succeed in our personal lives. So early on, it was really very protective. But we soon came to realize that anonymous free speech is part of, American history, and it also depersonalizes the issues so that when we complain about bias in museums, it's not about our personal situation.
When I mentioned that Guerrilla Girls formed, I believe in the 1980s, so tell us what was going on then that you and others felt the need to protest this inequality that you saw in the art world.
Well, the Museum of Modern Art opened after one of its renovations with an exhibition in 1984 called An International Survey of Painting and Sculpture. And when we did the count, there were about 200 artists in the show, and there were fewer than 17 women, and even fewer artists of color. And the fact that it was called An International Survey of Painting and Sculpture sort of struck us as being a little weird, that it was predominantly white men. How international is that? So we went to a protest that really didn't do very much. It was a standard protest with a picket line and placards, and all we did at the end of the day was make a lot of people going into the museum, angry. They really never thought about, the museum as being a place where there could possibly be bias. They really thought that the art world was a meritocracy. So a number of us took the vow that day that we were going to figure out a way to get that point across. And we came up with our first posters. They were always sort of a little bit shocking. They kind of used the language of advertising to get people's attention, and they always involved information that was irrefutable. So when we said, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum, we had to back that up with the information that, fewer than 5% of the artists in the museum were women, but 95% of the nudes were female.
And our listeners can see the image that you're talking about, one of them, on our website, wnpr.org/wherewelive. So, Frida, we're now at 2020. When you look back at the last several decades, what are some of the systemic factors that still perpetuate this lack of representation in museums and in collections today?
Well, certainly in what we call the knowledge industry, in colleges and universities, everyone realizes that there has been bias, and no one would possibly think that the history of art could be written without the work of women and artists of color, because we are in the culture. However, if you examine the art market, the place where art gets exchanged, you realize that women and artists of color are, financially disadvantaged. They are not given the resources of production the way white men are. Our last count, when we looked at the highest price paid for an artwork by a living male artist compared to a living female artist, the woman's price was 17% of the male's price. Now, when you're in the economics of it and you're really a professional, that is a disadvantage to not have those resources to work with, because it's far worse than the position of women and people of color in the general marketplace.
I wanted to bring in Min Jung Kim back into the conversation, director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. Min, we were talking again about this focus that your museum is taking this year, these several exhibitions exclusively for women artists. I can't help but think that museums do play a role in the fact that you are exhibiting these works, that you can help play a part in increasing the value of these works for these women artists. When we're talking about art dealers looking at, who's they should be paying attention to.
Right. Well, there are obviously many facets to the art world, and there's no doubt that museums can play a role and have an impact on the visibility and the success of an artist's career. And we see the statistical data that these gender disparities are really deep-rooted at institutional and museum levels. So it's really hard as a museum not to acknowledge that we are indeed also playing a contributing role to the imbalances of these systems. So once you're aware of these data, then I think you either have one of two choices. You either ignore and dismiss them and then become complicit with this systemic model of operation, or you renew a sense of critical agency. And then you start to take deliberate steps to ultimately create systemic change. And that's exactly why we felt that it was incumbent upon us, museums such as the New Britain Museum of American Art, to try and create real cultural change by making women's presence felt more a part of the normal rather than the exceptional practice in museums like ours, and to make a really conscious effort to reflect the demographic of the general public. I mean, half the population of the United States is women, and yet a very, very low percentage of women artists are represented in museums.
And what about the number of women who are leading these cultural institutions, Min?
Well, that has also been evolving. I think the number of women leading these cultural institutions have indeed been growing. That being said, women directors at the top museums over a particular budget of $20 million still is a very, very small number of women that are there. So there is still quite a lot of work to be done, and a big part of it is about raising awareness.
Frida Kahlo again. This is a pseudonym used by one of the founding members of the Guerrilla Girls. Did you want to add to what Min was saying about representation and, again, this focus for 1 year, but what needs to happen past 2020?
Well, I think in terms of looking at museums and the institutional structure of museums, I think it's important to look at who funds the museums and who runs the museums, i.e. the board of directors, versus who the tastemakers are. If we allow wealthy art collectors to be the tastemakers, it's really hard to expect that their choices will be diverse. I think the Guerrilla Girls have always been for some new economic model for museums and for the art world, and the idea of letting a small group of wealthy art collectors and the dealers who are their agents determine what our visual culture is not exactly democratic. It really goes back to the days of kings and queens and emperors deciding, what art is. So we really like to think of ourselves as a model there because, anyone can have a poster, of the Guerrilla Girls for $30. So we really want to look hard and fast at the way museums are funded. When they don't get federal or public funding, then they are at the mercy of whoever's interest it is to give money to the art world. And we also think that there should be ethical standards. I think it's questionable that an art collector can be a museum trustee because that's a conflict of interest.
What do you think about that, Min?
Well, it's a complicated and complex issue, but by and large, I think the New Britain Museum of American Art, we've been very fortunate to have a very committed group of individuals and supporters and board of trustees who not only are committed to the museum, but also committed to New Britain and the community at large. So a lot of these issues, as we are reflecting them in the context of American art, also parallels a lot of the issues related to our own communities. And that's been very much of our guiding light in terms of the kinds of programs, the kinds of exhibitions, and the kinds of works that we eventually accession and have as part of our permanent collection.
I should mention again, before we run out of time, that work by the Guerrilla Girls will also be featured again in this year-long series at the New Britain Museum of American Art. Again, I want to thank Frida Kahlo, one of the founding members of the Guerrilla Girls, for joining us today. We appreciate it. Thank you, Frida.
Sure, thanks. Great to be here.
And Min Jung Kim, again, we'll have information on our website for our listeners to learn more about this year-long series. But really interesting discussion. I look forward to continuing it throughout the year.
Yes, thank you.
Today's show, produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kion Wolf. And just a programming note, oftentimes our show is live at 9 a.m., but we also rebroadcast our show in the evening. That rebroadcast is going to be moving to 8 p.m. starting Monday, January 13th. But the best way to catch our show, if you can't listen live, is to download Where We Live on your favorite podcast app. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.